Hi, everybody. Welcome to Find My Team Conversations. My name is Barb Smith, and we have an awesome topic with it's, I can't even put words to this guy. He's the best. He's an expert, and he is full of knowledge that I know he's very, very excited to share with you all. So, the topic today is mental health for female athletes, an approach that proves successful. And Michael Huber has done this for years. He's a certified mental performance consultant with a master's degree in sports psychology. Mike helps young athletes to get their minds to work for them rather than against them through mental performance coaching. He's also the host of the Freshman Foundation podcast, which the links are in the bottom. You want to catch all of those shows, they're excellent. And I am kind of excited to say I've been on that show and had a great conversation. So we're back at this again with Mike's expertise, basically helping young athletes and families prepare for every next step in their journey and all the mental preparedness that you need to continue on into college. So welcome, Mike. I know that I had a brief intro for you, and there's so much more. But give us a fun fact about you that I didn't say in the intro.
Fun fact about me. That's a
Again,
good one.
catching you off guard right off the bat.
Yeah. So a fun fact about me is that sports psychology is my second career. So I left a career of almost 20 years in another profession. Um, and I decided that I wanted to do something more meaningful. And that ended up being what I do now, working with young athletes. So yeah, I think that's a pretty fun fact and it's related to the topic. So
That's an awesome fact. And we're glad that you made that switch. All of us who are here in the athletic world. So thanks for doing that. All right. So let's get serious right off the bat.
sure.
Post COVID, an increase in depression right now, an increase in suicide right now, an increase in the angst and the pressure for whatever reason has multiplied post COVID. So these are critical mental. It's mental health, right? It's mental health. So can you share what mental health is, in your opinion, and also what might be some of the causes of these increases right now? It's at every level, but it's definitely highlighted in the college level.
Yeah. So, I mean, mental health is obviously a big subject. Um, and I think to start with, why we're seeing maybe an uptick in some of those things that you mentioned, like depression and anxiety, et cetera. I think a lot of it has to do with uncertainty. I think there's, a lot of times people's mental health is tied to the fact that they don't know what's going to come next, or they don't know why something happened and they can't quite figure it out, or they sort of look back on it and say, I wish I could have done things differently. And effectively, a lot of times, you lose hope that things aren't going the way that you want them to, especially for a young athlete who's gone through the COVID years where they were having, years taken away from them. There was a lot of concern around health and safety issues. They didn't know where they were going to pop out on the other side of it. Obviously, there's a lot of things out there. So I think a lot of times it's the uncertainty that is sort of driving the mental health. But then to talk about mental health from my opinion, my perspective is, I think a lot of it is the ability to accept the circumstances that are around us, and being able to control what we can. And I think a lot of times just so many external factors that are out there for young athletes, whether it's in their sport, in their sporting career, or outside, that they just can't get a hold of and control. And I think a lot of times that leads to the symptoms of mental health, like anxiety, like depression, like all these other things. And ultimately, for me, I think the most important thing for an athlete or anybody, frankly, struggling with mental health is to be able to open up about it and ask for help. And I have my own experiences with that personally. And I know that it wasn't until I accepted the fact that I was going through some, mental health challenges and sought out help from the outside that things started to get a little bit better. But I think for a lot of young people, especially ones who are tended to perfectionism on some level, it's really hard to come forward and say, hey, I think something's wrong and I need help.
And, that leads me to this other question just that just popped into my head that, why it's looked at as because, all right, so I've coached female student athletes for a long, long time. And to say, to voice, vocal or voice that you have a mental health issue is like taboo. It's like there's a stigma. Coach is going to think I'm weak. Teammates are going to think I'm weak. I can't let this out to the public. There's this whole like stigma about,
Mhm.
oh, it's bad. It's a bad word. How can we get past that? Because that's still very much, even though it's more, you see it more like with professional athletes coming out with this and things.
Sure.
It's still, it can't be me. I'm strong. I can't let weakness show. How can we get past that?
I mean, I think frankly, it's the adults normalizing that it's okay, right? So whether it's a parent or a coach, normalizing and being proactive and saying like, hey, if there's something bothering you or there's something that's going on in your life, I want to know about it because I'm going to put you, the person, before the performer. And I think most coaches are on that path. Like they believe that, but they don't necessarily say it outwardly to the point where a young person feels like they have permission to come forward, right? Because I think a lot of times we put them in the performer bucket and they have to perform. And if they, like you said, if they come forward to a coach or even a parent and say, like, hey, I'm not feeling right, or I don't want to participate, this is too much for me, they're going to try to be talked out of it because a lot of times it's like, well, you know, there's going to be a consequence, right? Like if you stop now or you take a break, it's going to hurt your future or you're going to regret this. I mean, I've been dealing with this right now with some folks who like they just can't do it anymore because there's so much pressure and they're getting pushback from the adults in the room saying rather than just saying, hey, you do what you got to do to get better, right? To take some time away. And we know that maybe there is an athletic consequence, but we got to put you first. And I think a lot of times the young people don't hear that or see that or feel that. And so they feel like they can't come forward because they're going to be persuaded to stay, or they're going to be viewed as somebody who has something wrong with them or a liability.
So it really depends on the support network around the student athlete, um, because sometimes the parents also feel that it's not my daughter. It's not my daughter that this is happening to, or we can't tell people because because we've got to get the scholarship, you know. So the support group of the student athletes sometimes could be part of the issue. No, please, parents, don't call me and be mad at me for saying something like this, but it's sometimes, and they may not even be aware of it. And coaches get so tunnel vision. I was a coach. I get it.
Yeah.
Tunnel, next game, next practice, next crises. I need all of my players for this next game, and sometimes there's blinders put on. What would you say to these two different adult groups that are the support system for the student athletes?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I think you said, first of all, I think you said something that's really important. I think a lot of times it's not intentional, right? There's just a lack of awareness. And frankly, and maybe not, in the mental health space, obviously it's a little bit more, is more urgent or pronounced. But I think a lot of times, it's also up to the young person to come forward and they have some responsibility in saying, hey, I need help because ultimately, like you can't make somebody do something that they don't want to do, or you don't necessarily know as a coach or a parent that this is going on. You might suspect it, but you don't know for sure. And I think the advice I always give to parents, particularly, but coaches as well, is really if you see something, ask more questions. I think one of the things that you know, coaches and parents, adults in general tend to do, teachers, is they tend to tell young people, what they think they need to do to improve or fix a problem, rather than asking them questions to give them the permission to come forward and say, hey, you know what, I'm not all right, or this is what's going on. And letting them sort of also solve their problems. I think a lot of time we're so quick to try to solve a problem for a young person and they resent that. Right. And so I think a lot of times asking those questions, particularly the big ones, how are you doing? What's going on? What can I do to help? How are you feeling? Right. Those big open questions, I think a lot of times gives us the clues to know that, hey, something really is going on here, and to let them know we're there to help them rather than to fix them. Cause to me, those are two different things.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great insight there with that, because sooner or later it catches up and can be devastating, obviously, as we've
Mhm.
seen sometimes. So so Michael, what is your approach? Let's say I'm a student athlete and I'm going day to day and I'm prepared for struggle. Like I know that as a student athlete, I'm gonna have some struggle in college. I'm having some right now in high school. And how do I know that I even have an issue? Because I am supposed to struggle some. I know that it is supposed to be hard at times. When is it something that I should say, this just doesn't feel right?
So I would put my sports psychology hat on and saying that, a lot of times athletes have performance issues, right? Performance anxiety, they have, doubts, they have concerns or whatever. When that starts to seep into other areas of your life, like your social relationships, your academics, or I can't get out of bed. I'm nervous about what's to come beyond athletics. When you start to see it in your everyday life, like to me, that's really the sign of maybe there's something bigger going on, which I would deem to be a clinical issue, right? So more global in nature, outside the performance realm, and it's really affecting your life to the point where getting out of bed or just functioning on a day-to-day basis is really hard. Versus, hey, sports are hard. Maybe I am having some performance anxiety. Maybe I am struggling on the court or on the field, but that's different, right? Because it is hard, right? But if life is hard every single day just to get out of bed or just to kind of cope with the things that we have to do and interactions that we have, to me, that's a real sign that, hey, there's something bigger, going on than just, hey, I'm struggling with my sport.
Yeah. So what's the first step? Let's say a, student athlete might not be able to go talk to the coach yet because, you know, doesn't want to bother the coach or thinks that it could be a not an important enough problem, or the coach, we got a game tomorrow, can't go to the coach. What are some other things that that student athlete could do, even if even if she's in high school?
Yeah. First of all, I think the key concept there is trust, right? I think talking to someone that you trust is important, right? Because if you can get something off your chest, a lot of times, people who suffer from anxiety, and I happen to be one of them, right? Sometimes people who suffer from anxiety see that things are a lot, make things out to be a lot worse or bigger than they actually are in reality. And when you talk to somebody and you get it off your chest, a lot of times it tends to be normalized. But I think having that conversation with somebody that you don't trust, that has your best interests at heart, is could make, could do more harm than good. Right. So if it's a friend, a sibling, parent potentially, right, somebody, a counselor, having that conversation. Some people aren't comfortable having that conversation though, right? Even if they trust the person, they're not ready to sort of come forward and admit or share that they feel like they're having a problem. Something that I suggest to a lot of athletes is, pick up a notebook, right? And write down kind of what's going on. Like identify your feelings. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What's going on? Like trying to getting it onto paper is maybe not as good as talking to someone about it. But I think if you put it onto paper a lot of times, it's a good first step in acknowledging what's going on. Because so many times when if we don't get it outside of us, right? Whether it's on paper or having a conversation, those thoughts and feelings live inside of us and they multiply, right? They sort of have to take on the life of their own and they just continue to boil and grow. And, then that leads to sort of just this exaggerated effect. And, I think that that's where a lot of young people end up. It just builds up so much and they don't feel like there's any way out. And that's where people really start to struggle with now you start to get to a point where people think about, hey, maybe will I take my life, right? Because there's no hope and I don't see any way out, right? The longer it festers, the harder it's going to be to let it go. And I think, just picking up a journal and writing some things down could be a really good way to get it outside without actually having to be as vulnerable as talking to somebody about it.
Yeah. I mean, I learned something new in all of these conversations, and this one is no different. That's a great way to, to think about it. It's not, it can come out of you, that those feelings could come out of you, and you could feel better, immediately, obviously, depending on where you are in your struggle, but that's a just a great insightful thing. So in your experience, what are the top issues, that you're dealing with some student athletes families right now, you're working with people, what are the top issues that student athletes are dealing with mental issues or mental health?
um, so I'm lucky in that I don't have a lot of my clients who suffer from issues outside of the performance realm. Um, and frankly, that's all I'm qualified to do is I'm qualified to work with athletes in the performance realm, but I'm also trained and qualified to refer them out to clinical providers who can treat more global issues, right? So I don't have a lot of those right now, but I will say this. I will say that probably and I said it before, the most consistent issue that I identify is perfectionism, the fear of failure, and the appearance that I am always doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I don't think perfectionism is a yes or no equation. It's not, yeah, you are, you aren't. It's really, to me, a spectrum, right? I think all of us have a certain degree of it. And the best performers, frankly, have a fair amount of it because they're so meticulous and they're so diligent about getting better at what they do, their sport, right? So they need that fear of failure or they need that drive to be the best to help them get to where they want to go. But at a certain point, you sort of tip off a cliff where athletes are afraid to make mistakes because they don't want someone to think that they're not capable or they're not meeting expectations. And that's where we start to see the lead into more global issues, where you start to see psychosomatic issues, right? So what do I mean by that? Like symptoms, right? People like, I've had clients who've gotten to the point where they got so anxious that they vomited, right? Or I have clients or people that I know of that have had vocal cord dysfunction, which is basically the result of like tension and stress from sort of this natural stress reaction of like, reflux and all these different kinds of things that they have as a result of this anxiety that comes from like just the fear of making a mistake or the fear of being judged. And I think that that's the biggest one, and I think we live in a world, and maybe you don't want to cross this bridge, but we live in a world where there's a lot of eyeballs on kids, young athletes at a very young age. And when you pay attention to that, which I'm sure you do at some level because of the work that you do and I do as well, we only see the good things, right? We only see the good things in social media. We only hear the good things from our clients a lot of the time. Everything's going great or things are going well. I'm fine. I'm fine. It's okay. I had a great game. I did this, and this. Meanwhile, there's all these things that they're struggling with or things that they're challenged with, and they're putting them to the side and they're locking them inside of them because they don't want anyone to see like, this is what I'm struggling with. Right. The irony of that is that if you don't bring that to the surface, you can't work on it to get better. And so it's this like constant, like, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde effect of like, I just want to show everybody the really good side of me. And I can't show the warts because I'm not going to get recruited. I'm not going to get playing time. What are they going to think of me? All these different things. And, it's not real, right? We all make mistakes, but I think the feeling from the young person is real that they feel like they can't let other people down and that these expectations for themselves are so high that it drives them to a place where they start to really have these really, really serious reactions, physical and otherwise, that are leading them to be reluctant to even take steps forward at certain points.
Yeah, so let's just dive into the sports performance because it's really interesting, and I've felt this myself. Okay, so let's say you're a free throw, you're shooting free throws, and one goes down and two goes down. You're trying to make 10 in a row. We used to do this, at the end of practice, make 10 in a row before you leave, or do something that is simple before you leave. So lo and behold, number 9 goes down, and number 10 feels like the basket has shrunk to a size the ball can't fit in there. Or you're the last batter and you've got 2 strikes, and the ball seems like it's a golf ball instead of a baseball or a softball now. It's what happens there that causes these constrictions in performance when there's a little more pressure.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the simplest way to put it is that our brains are programmed to detect threat at a very, very high level, right? A very strong signal gets put out when we're threatened. And those situations that you're describing is a threat, right? It's a threat to that athlete's identity of like, hey, if I don't make this, there's a consequence or something's going to happen. Or so the brain's telling us like, don't mess up, don't mess up. Now, meanwhile, when the brain tells us not to mess up, everything around the brain, including our body, tenses up and we lose the ability to just go execute physically what we know we've done thousands of times because now we perceive that there's a risk or a negative consequence. And so we kind of tighten up. I mean, that's just the best way to put it. So for me, when I look at that with any athlete, regardless of sport, I'm always pushing young athletes toward a process orientation, right? So what do I mean by that, right? Getting to a point where they are really focused on what they can control and what they do in each rep, regardless of the circumstances around it, right? So when you get into that situation and you're at the free throw line and you're tied or down one in a game, right? I'm not saying you're not going to feel the pressure, but how do you rely on that process that you've developed, that you've continually routinized to the point where you say, okay, like I know this is a rough situation. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the same thing I do every time. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to spin the ball. I'm going to focus in on a certain point on the rim, and I'm going to let it go. And also being able to practice, well, not being able to practicing accepting the results, right? I think that is something that young athletes are awful at. There's so much emphasis on the result, and they can't accept when they don't get the outcomes that they want. And so let's keep it into a basketball context because I know you're a basketball person, right? Like I'll ask a shooter, I'll say like, is it, would you rather have, take an open look every time you have it, right? Regardless of whether or not it goes down versus I'm forcing up bad shots with somebody in my face, but they're going down into the basket, right? My point being to them is, hey, listen, like if you just set a rule for yourself, like if I'm open, I'm going to shoot it, then I'm not going to worry about it going down. Success is the execution of the process, right? It's not the result. Versus like, hey, I got a couple of lucky shots. The guy had a hand in my face and I heaved it up and it went in. Like, hey, that was a great shot. No, it wasn't. It was a terrible shot, but it went in, right? It's so right. And what I try to tell them is, hey, listen, over time, right? If you play the long game over time, if you stick to that process of, hey, I get an open look, I take it, more shots are going to go down than otherwise. But if you look at every shot as, like the end of the world, and then now I'm 0 for 1 and I have to make the next one, it's 0 for 2. And right, like that's not, you've got a bunch of games ahead of you. Like, but young athletes are always looking at the smallest, but that next pitch, that next at bat, that next shot. If they don't make it, oh no, now I have to make the next one. No, you don't. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like how we judge ourselves and the way we perform and, looking at things other than results is so huge. But for me, when I get involved with a lot of athletes, you're 10, 12 years down the road with, they've been conditioned. I tell them all the time, from the time you're 5 years old, every time you make a shot or every time you hit a ball, mom and dad clap and go, yay, right? Like we're conditioned to be like, that's what people want to see from us. And when we don't do it, it's like, oh, you missed, right? And so now I've got 10, 12, 13 years of programming of like, everybody claps when I make it. And when I don't make it, they don't clap. Like now that's a disappointment. So you have to sort of like, I have to like work backwards and say, hey, listen, like you just need to focus on what you can control. And that takes some time. And some kids never get it because they're just so results oriented that, that's the only way they can see things.
Yeah. So, kind of along those same lines, I know that there are lots of student athletes who, and you said this earlier, they feel like they're going to let somebody down. So, somebody outside themselves, they're going to let down, whether it be a coach, a teammate, a parent, a grandpa or grandma, or somebody else. Um, how can they? That can't be the way that they're moving forward in life, because they're always going to let somebody down, right? So how can they let that go? Um, because I know it's a big one, especially for females.
Yeah. Yeah, it is it's a very big one. And a lot of times it's implied, which makes it even harder, meaning it's not like a parent or somebody, a loved one or a teammate or a coach is coming to say like, you let me down, right? You disappointed me. It's implied. It's within the athlete. They assume that they're letting them down. It's unspoken, right? So
Right.
how could they let that go? I mean, I think it takes some practice, right? Unless you have an explicit, permission from those people. And even sometimes if somebody says, I don't care, right? Parents will say all the time, I don't care if you win or lose. And I don't care if you score a goal, or I don't care if you score 20 points. Even if they say that, the young person still might not believe it, right? So they've got to believe it themselves. And I think it takes some practice, and I think a lot of it is looking at, a lot of times what I'll do with an athlete is have them look at their identity, right? What do I mean by that? A lot of times, young people, if I drew a circle, I'll say, hey, break this circle up and assume it equals 100% and tell me like the different elements of your identity. And a lot of the time, it is significantly skewed to athlete because of the amount of time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears, and all the things they put into it. And I think from there, it starts to make sense to them that the reason why it is so important to them what they do, whether it is for themselves or for somebody else, is because it's just such a big part of who they see themselves to be. And so I think a lot of times it's then once you develop that awareness of that, hey, what if I were to put more emphasis on some of these other things in my life, and realize that to my parents and to my friends and my siblings and my teammates, like I'm more than just a player, right? But I don't think that is I don't think that's typical. I think it is very uncommon for a player to be out there and be like, hey, I missed a shot, but I know everyone's got my back after the game. It's just one shot or whatever. I had a bad game. No, it's like I'm a failure because I look at myself as athlete first and everything else second. And I think everybody feels like I'm a letdown. Most people don't feel that way. You feel that way because of all this emphasis you've put on your sport. So I think it's helping them to understand that they're way more than just being an athlete. And a lot of times they just don't have that awareness. Like just to do an exercise like that, that's so simple. They're like, oh, wow. Like I didn't ever realize that like being a son and being a brother and being a student and this and that, like they're basically subordinated completely to athlete. And that's a source of the anxiety and the expectation a lot of the times.
Yeah, I so see that in recruiting, that student athletes will look at the college and they'll look at the athletics first, and they will shelve everything else about themselves, as you just said, until they find the athletic fit. And then they'll try to, squeeze these other things in to make them fit, but they may or may not be a fit. So that's all the things you say, sister, brother, students, all those things, their personal life, the culture, all of those things get shelved. And I believe that's why there's so much, angst in college and transfer. Even starters are transferring, right? So something else, I mean, the athletic world is great if you're starting, right? Something else is going on. And I feel like it's because we have, turned into athlete, maybe student second, and maybe the person last. And sometimes the person comes for before the student, but athlete is always first, instead of the person being the very first and most important thing. And I know that's what you do in your work, and I'm helping young
Yeah.
women try to figure that out, is who are you first before all of that college stuff happens.
Yeah. It's super interesting. And it's interesting if like, as I'm thinking, as I was thinking when you were talking, it's like in some ways, I think young athletes might spend more time with sports in a given year than school, right? Because they're playing all year round, they're training all year round.
Yeah.
Like if you go hour for hour, it's pretty darn close, right? And so, right, there's a huge investment in that process, time, energy, financial, etc. And when we get to the end of the line, right, a lot of times the payoff that we want is the recognition of that effort, which for a lot of people is I'm getting a Division I scholarship. I think ultimately, like if you boil it down, that's what it is, right? Like I want to go D1, which is something I'm sure you hear all the time. I certainly hear it all the time. And when they don't go D1, there's a disappointment, but there's all these other factors that go into selecting a college. Like I tell people all the time, kids, it's like you have to live there for 4 years. Like you go there and yeah, you made the best program you can make, and that's great. And everybody thinks you're special, but now you have to live there. Do you really want to be there all year round, all the time? Like, and I just don't think that's something a lot of kids grasp until they actually throw themselves into that fire. And then they're like, oh, I don't want to be here. It sucks. Like, I'm going to transfer now. Right. But they didn't think about that before. And
Yeah.
I think having that counsel that you give is huge because choosing a college is something that's going to, just wait, reflect on them. They're going to reflect on it for the rest of their lives. And if you pick it just for sports, you're probably going to be disappointed.
And the transfer portal thing is there now. So it seems like there's this impression that it's easy to get in that thing and get out and get somewhere else. But there's a huge disruption in life to the team you're leaving and the team that's, where you're arriving. Plus, it's a lot easier to get in that portal than it is to get out. So there's a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
in the transfer portal who are not going to play anymore, or they're going to stay at the school and not play, or they're going to go to another even division and have to pay. I mean, and there's so much other stuff that people don't know about that transfer portal, that you really do want to try to find the right fit in a college and be able to be there, and also to be acclimated and ready as what you're doing, Michael, with the mental side of it, to be able to handle the added pressure of college life and the added, you've got school, you've got extra practice, you've got the normal practice, you've got games, you've got travel, you've got community service, you've got speaking, you have booster events, you have so many things in college. Really, it doesn't matter what level, but you're still going to have these things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take out the level, it really is a lot of the same makeup. The structures might be a little different, but it's a lot of added pressure.
Yeah.
So you really want to do your homework, and surround yourself with our services to help you get there.
Yeah, and listen, I think even if you do your homework and you put the time and energy into research it and ask the good questions to visit, right? There's still no guarantee of success when you get there, because being there and living in that situation and participating on that team is just going to be different than what you get sold in the recruiting process, right? Like you just don't really know until you know. And I think for me, the question is, you know, why are you attempting to transfer out, right? Is it only because of playing time? Because if you don't play as a freshman, that used to be normal, right? It used to be normal that freshmen didn't play their first year and you come in and you learn. Now there's this expectation of like, I want to play. So now I'm going to hop around to get playing time. But I think looking at the situation as a whole and being able to assess, like I have two clients in particular. One is a male, one is a female. Both now are juniors in college at very, very prestigious academic universities. And both want to play different sports. And they both went through COVID. They both struggled for a year, if not two. And you come around to this idea of like, is it really worth it to stick this out here, given that I have to put in all this effort? But ultimately, both of these young people who are now, like I said, juniors, like they were able to work through it, right? And really look at the big picture, saying, hey, if I get a degree from this place, that's really the payoff here because I'm probably not going to be a professional. Or if I am, it's only going to last me so long. Right. And B, like there are other factors like here. And like maybe I'm not playing because I'm not good enough. Right. Maybe I need to get better. Right. So why not stay here where I'm comfortable to your point and not bounce around and uproot yourself and start over and really just put the effort in. And frankly, I think a lot of it comes down to communication, right? Ultimately, it's about understanding where you fit and where you stand as an athlete. And I think that's one of the biggest deficiencies that I see with my young athletes is they just don't have the comfort advocating for themselves, right? So what do I mean by that? Like knocking on the door and having a conversation with the coach to say like, "Hey, what's your reasoning behind this decision? Like, what do I need to do differently? Do I have a future here? Right? What do you see for me? Right? All these questions like to help you understand. And a lot of times when my clients come out of those conversations because I coach them on that. Right? What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? They come back and say, how did it go? And they say, oh, it went okay. Did you hear what you wanted to hear? Well, not exactly, but at least I know now. I'm like, okay, so what do you feel? Relieved, right? I know where I stand. Like I went in, I was an adult, I asked the question and I got an answer. And now I know that I need to change some things to fit in with what their expectations are. And I think that that's the real lesson of perseverance, resilience for an athlete at any level is being able to work through those challenges because sometimes it is the things around you like coaches and officials and whatever else, but a lot of times it's also you, right? And
Yeah.
I think we're so self-centered sometimes, not just us, just not just kids, everybody. We think it's not us, it's everybody else. It's not, that's not always the case. There's sometimes you have to just reflect on, hey, I need to be better. And I can run away or I could stay and fight and get better.
So you just mentioned what you do. And so let's kind of talk about it a little bit. What is mental performance coaching? What is it that you do with your clients?
Yeah. So, I mean, effectively, my job is to help them develop strategies, mental and emotional strategies that they can use on their own because nobody else could do that for them so that they can work through the challenges that they have as athletes and they apply they leak over obviously into everyday life, right? But give them strategies to work through those challenges, whether it's in a game situation where they're performing and they need to you know, focus or relax or whatever it is, right? Finding ways to work through it on their own or find ways to endure the grind of, I got to get up every day and go to practice and I'm putting in all this work and like just finding strategies that work for them to be able to manage it so it doesn't become overwhelming. And so it's really just teaching. It's teaching and sharing and helping them figure out ways to use those strategies so that they can apply it in their lives and as performers and otherwise.
So do you have like a story of somebody who kind of just to give an example of somebody that had an issue and how obviously not all the steps, but just sort of short story how you help them through an issue.
Sure. Everybody's different, and I will say that for me, my philosophy, my approach to coaching is it's really important to understand the person. So not every strategy fits every person. And so understanding how people learn and understand what their goals are and motivations, et cetera, all matters, right? But I'll go to one athlete that this always stands out to me because it was really one of my greatest successes, and it was actually while I was still, in training. I wasn't even working with a client. I wasn't like, I wasn't out of school yet. I was still in school, and I was interning at a high school, and I worked with this athlete. He was a baseball player, he was a pitcher, and I would ask him, I always ask athletes, like, what do you think you need to get better at? Right. Cause I want to understand their perception of like, are there certain elements of your game that you see like, okay, like I know that I need help with this. They're going to be much more likely to engage and invest in the process if they feel like it's their idea. I need to get better at this. So he had a particular deficiency. He for self-perceived deficiency in his game as a pitcher. one particular element of it. And he said, like, I don't really pitch well out of the stretch, which, if you know sports, is basically like when there's a runner on base, he would get really discombobulated. So he had to change the way he pitched to keep the runners on. So the runners would make him basically nervous, right? So when somebody got on, he would start walking guys around the bases because he was concerned about all this other stuff that was going on around him that he couldn't control. And it wasn't until he got back to sort of pitching out of the windup, which is the other way you would pitch, that he was much more comfortable. Then he would start striking guys out again. So we worked on that. And so I said to him, so how do you want this to look in your mind? Right. So we did imagery or visualization exercise where I helped him to paint the picture in his mind of, this is what I want it to look like. So he would practice it over and over and over, listening to the script that we generated. And he was basically, in essence, getting these mental reps of seeing what he wanted to do before he did it. And ultimately, by doing that, he got to a place where he was actually more comfortable pitching out of the stretch position as a pitcher. And now in college, he's a reliever. So as a reliever, if you know anything about relief pitching, you only pitch out of the stretch. So he got to a point where he didn't want to do it at all. He was like deathly afraid of it, to now he does it all the time. So really attacking those perceived deficiencies and trying to find a way that fits the athlete's needs and their the way they process things is really important. Some people are visual, some people are verbal. You know, everybody learns differently, and trying to find a strategy that fits and giving it to them, and then ultimately holding them to account. Right? I can only make an athlete do so much, but the way I put it is like, if you go, if you go to the gym just the day before a game, probably not going to be good enough, right? You go to the gym every day. If you try to do this the day of a game or the day before a game and think it's going to work, you're sorely mistaken, right? So I try to make them understand that there has to be a concerted effort, a practice around these mental strategies to the point where you're comfortable manipulating them and using them and applying them. Otherwise, you're just going to be adding something new to the mix when you're competing that you're not comfortable with, which is going to add more stress into the system, right? So really getting them to focus on execution and practice.
Excellent. So when people come to you, when student athletes come to you, is it because they have, like, let's say, an issue with pitching, or is it because they have an issue with performance, or is this because they have an issue with life? Um, is it I got one issue, I got multiple issues, or I'm just floundering.
If I'm being truthful, it's usually the parents coming to me saying my kid has a problem with their performance. Like, that is like the number one answer for playing Family Feud here, right? Like, my kid, I really think my kid is messed up. I can see that they're not confident, and I'm really afraid that they're gonna blow their chance here because they're not mentally where they need to be. Which, depending on whether or not the kid agrees, it depends, right? Like, some athletes will come to me and say, yes, I need help. My parents are right. Like, can you help me? And a lot of times they'll buy in. But sometimes I'll get, athletes who say, like, I don't need this. Like, my parents think there's something going on with me, but I'm fine. Right. There's nothing wrong with me. To go back to our earlier conversation about, like, there's a very much a reluctance to admit, that something is wrong, that I have something wrong with me. I'll figure it out myself. I don't need your help. I'm fine. And what I tell the parents is, listen, until they make that choice to come forward and ask for help, you can't make them do it. Or you can try to make them do it, but you're wasting everybody's resources, because unless they're motivated to make that change on their own, you're not only it's probably going to be unproductive, but you're probably going to make the problem worse, because what they're seeing and perceiving is, all you care about is me as an athlete. You don't care about me as a person. You're not listening to me and to what I want. And so it can be a little bit tricky. So I try to make sure before I start working with somebody that everybody's on the same page of, this is why we're doing it. This is what we're going to try. And is everybody bought in? And maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, because there's no guarantee of results. But at least if everybody's motivated, the odds go way up that something good is going to happen through the process, versus trying to force a square peg into a round hole. And now you've got just everybody spinning their wheels.
That makes sense. And speaking of parents, and I know we're running out of time here, but just a couple more questions. Speaking of parents, do you think um, that sometimes parents aren't aware that they're actually adding to the pressure of their student athlete? And could you, and let's just talk about their performance, their performance in sports. Can you give parents some, maybe just tips or some advice about how to like just check yourself to make sure that you're not adding to it? First of all, you have to be aware, but of your student athlete or your child. But what are some tips that you can share to help them say, "Hey, man, I got to step back a little bit."
Yeah, this comes up. It comes up a lot. It comes up for me. I'm a parent, and even though I study this and I'm aware of it, sometimes it's still really hard, right? So I think the first thing I would say to a parent, being a parent, is that like I know you're trying your best, right? It is emotional. You want the best for your child. It's absolutely okay, right? It's better than not caring at all. But right, I think there's a couple of questions that you have to ask yourself, right? One is, how would you feel? How would you respond if your mother or father was acting the way or saying the things that you're saying to you? And I think the answer to that a lot of times is I would hate it, right? But I think the parent believes that they're helping. And I think it's out of fear, one, that the kid's not performing as well as they can. But two, I think it's just that the natural instinct to want to control. And I think a lot of times parents absolutely don't realize they're doing it. And sometimes it's not even what they say. It can be the timing of what they say, the timing of the conversation, whether it's during a game or in the car, right? At certain points, timing of and just the way you say it. Like I know this because I hear it from my own kids and they recognize it, not necessarily from me, but from other people. Like the way that people like viscerally react and like tone of their voice, like the screeching or like the screaming, like the way they're screaming is like, somebody was taking their, stealing their handbag or their car, like stop thief. And it's just a game. And the kids are like, why are you screaming like this? It's crazy, right? Like, so like being aware of that. One of the things I would certainly recommend to parents, and I've written about this some, is having some strategies for yourself, when you catch yourself, in that place. One is just like with, as a parent, we have a really, really important job, right? We're performers just as much as the athletes are. To me, meditation, just a little bit every day helps to heighten awareness, right? If I understand when I'm heating up, when my mind is racing, when I'm getting out of control, I can stop myself sooner. It's the same advice I'd give to an athlete. Two is use your breathing, take a deep breath and relax, slow your heart rate down, like just calm down, right? Like if you find yourself getting crazy, like take a deep breath, right? And find a way to reset, right? Like it's just like an athlete. I work on this with athletes all the time. When you make a mistake, things go out of whack, you get nervous, your heart starts to race, your head starts to spin. Like you got to reset yourself to get back into the present moment, right? For a parent, it's the same thing. Hey, I'm here to support my kid, right? That's the goal, right? What does the support look like? Right. Well, maybe I need to ask my kid what they want from me, right? Versus me assuming I know what's best for them. That does not go over well with kids. I mean, I had this experience with my daughter a few months ago. I've been telling the story a ton, but it really like, it's like a case study in what not to do in sports parenting. And I was the culprit, right? Where she's playing in this soccer game over the summer and I'm yelling at it because I used to coach soccer. I'm not an expert, but I used to coach and I'm like, I know how they were being coached on a different team. And I was like, you need to get goal side. You need to get goal side. Meanwhile, the coach was telling them to come forward to bait them into an offsides trap, which I didn't know. And so my daughter said, Dad, she's like, I have a coach. She's like, you're not the coach. Let my coach coach. And if I need something, I'll go to him. And I was like, she got me, she was right. Like I got caught up in the moment of like, I was afraid that my daughter was going to make a mistake and that it was going to affect her. And I didn't want her to. So I'm coaching from the sidelines. And I realized like she has a coach. Like I don't know what the coach is saying. She understands, like she doesn't need me to give her advice. And ever since then, it's just been like, it's either encouragement That's it. You know what I'm saying? Because
Wow,
they pick up on it. Yeah. And we
that's
all are susceptible to it because we want the best for our kids. But if you're not aware of it, it could really spin out of control because then all of a sudden you're starting to affect the parent child relationship outside of sports too, because it becomes like carries over outside of what's going on in the field.
yeah. Yeah. Wow, how insightful of your daughter to put that all together. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so taking this now to the coach's side. All right. So, and maybe your answers are similar, but sometimes coaches don't realize that they're adding to the pressures and the stress of the student athlete. They're trying to push them, as we know that that's a good thing. They need to be pushed, they need to be coached, they need to be critiqued and feedback and all those sorts of things. But is there a way where a coach can see themselves like they're going maybe going too far with this athlete, and every athlete is going to be a little bit different? Do they have, would you have some sense of or some tips or advice for them to just maybe just check themselves as well?
So first and foremost, I'll start by saying I think coaches are in a bit different position, right? And what do I mean by that? Coaches get paid to win games. I mean, that's just the brutal truth of it, right? So, and I talk to athletes about this all the time is to say you need to put yourself in coach's shoes. They've got a big roster of people that extends beyond the number of places they have in a given game, right? Someone's got to sit and they got to do what's best for the team. Oh, and by the way, if they don't produce success, however that's defined, they're going to be out of a job, right? So I think there's an element of pressure for them that parents I think make it up more than anything. Coaches really do have that pressure because if they get fired, they're not getting paid, right? That being said, to me, I think the answer is, in a, facilitating or encouraging a two-way street, right? A two-way relationship, right? I'm the coach, right? And what I say goes, but I am open to your feedback, or my door is open so that you feel like you can express yourself to me as a player. Because a lot of times, if I'm a coach and I've got 30, if I'm a football coach, maybe I got 80 kids, I can't possibly know what's going on with any of them or all of them at the same time. If somebody has an issue, I want the kid to know that I'm okay. I want to hear about it and I'm willing to talk to you about it. And if the athlete trusts that coach, if it's genuine, then I think you alleviate a lot of the problems because again, I think you have to put some of the onus on the young person. It's a different relationship between a coach and an athlete and a parent and an athlete, right? Yeah, coaches may love their kids, but it's not implied. Whereas with the parent relationship, love is implied. Like that's first beyond anything. So in a coaching, put the onus on the young person, especially if they're in high school or college, to say, hey, like I'm going to give you this open door, and if something's going on, I need to hear about it because I can't, right? I can't police everybody. But if you come to me and you tell me something that's on your mind or that's bothering you, like I'm going to do my best to honor it, and that builds the trust to say, hey, it's a two-way street. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. And you mentioned perfectionism as one of the top issues that student athletes are dealing with. Just a short story for me. I worked with an athlete when I was coaching who was such a perfectionist that every single day she had to be working on her game. And if it didn't go well, she was so hard on herself that she would increase the time, or in there had to be some consequence there. And this did not come from coaches. This was coming from her. And we were, a little nervous about this is going to explode one day. And so we tried to, talk to her and bring her out of that. But, she came close to a nervous breakdown, just trying so hard. And I see that with younger girls who are quitting early in sports because this pressure to perform is so great. And I'm trying to think, how could we help these young kids first stay in sport, but also just this is a big one for, especially like I was saying, for females. she was so worked up about it. I can't even describe it, that it, it was.
Yeah,
Like,
I can picture it. Yeah, and I think this is probably the hardest thing to swallow, which is as a coach, there's a lot of baggage, there's a lot of history that happens before they even get to you, right? Family relationships, trauma, just the way that they're raised athletically, right? What the expectations are, right? So like when they get to, especially at that college level, right, they're already like fully formed. And so, it's really hard to undo what's already been done. And a lot of that's personality too, which is really not up to us, right? So I think that's where asking those questions and really like having the athlete understand that or trust that you have their best interest at heart, that gives them the open door to come to you when they're ready. Because you could try a lot of things, but it doesn't mean they're going to take. And it's not your fault, right? Like if you're doing all that you can as a coach and that young person's not adopting a change or like even open to a change, is that really on you? I would say no, right? But you have to be able to look in the mirror and say, like, have I done everything I can for this young person? But at a certain point, if that's just the way they are, then sometimes we have to suffer the worst consequences before we make a change. And that's just the God's honest truth. We're only gonna ask for help when things get to the very bottom. And that sometimes that's the hardest thing for an adult to say with a young person is, hey, there's nothing I can do and I have to watch it happen. And you know what? Maybe I just have to see it play out. And that's really hard for any grown up, whether it's a parent or coach or otherwise, to let happen. But sometimes you can't do anything about it. And that's really hard.
yeah, it's tough when there's been, and for her, there had just been so much success, so
Hmm.
much, so much, so much success. And she worked very, very hard. And
Yeah.
I think college was the first time that she was really pushed beyond her comfort zone, and it really affected her. And she's doing fine in life. She's great people. But this was definitely something that took some work to get
Hmm.
by this. So how do people find you?
The best way to find me is on my website. It's Michael V as in Vincent Huber.com. It has my blog posts, it has my podcasts, it has information about me, it has free resources. Pretty much everything that you would need is there. And my social media, etc.
Excellent. So parents can call, student athletes can call, it doesn't matter.
Yep,
Um, just try to get in touch with you if they want some help in this area.
absolutely.
Aw-
Anytime.
Awesome. Well, I'm so thankful and grateful that you're here and that you're doing what you're doing. I know there's a huge need, and I'm certainly hopeful more and more people will continue to take care of themselves as the athlete and the person and the student and all those different parts that really
Yeah.
make you who you are in life. And so, Michael, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It was great to talk to you today.
And thank you to all of our listeners in Find My Team Conversations. We'll be back with more. Thank you.